He digs graves for strangers, yet leaves no headstone for his vanished son, guarding that silence like a final possession. Today, a lone lantern blazes on the hill at noon, an impossible glow that shatters every rule the dead are meant to keep. If he dares follow its trail, the earth swears it will reveal the boy's fate, but only by burying the father in a truth he may not survive. Please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss any of our new stories. Stay tuned and watch till the end to find out the secret of the gravedigger and his vanished son. In Stoneview, where the salt flats winked like scales beneath a harsh sun, and the cemetery climbed a hill like a sober hymn, a peculiar wonder marked every new moon. Grave lanterns bloomed as if the earth itself lifted small bowls of light to guide the newly dead toward the river mother's road. These lanterns were not candles or gas, and no wick could be found inside them. They pulsed a soft amber, rising from soil the way mushrooms rise after rain. At first, people called them mercy, then rumor, then law. Families learned to follow each beat of light with prayers, and the hill learned to accept quiet footsteps with gratitude. But one noon a lantern trembled against the rules of its kind, stuttered alive under the wrong sun, and threw a weak circle against the caretaker's hut. That was the day Thomas Bell, gravedigger of Stoneview, felt the earth tug at his coat like a child and realized the hill was ready to answer a question it had carried for too long. His son Elias had vanished years earlier without grave, without farewell, without the decency of a story to hold the edges of grief. The hill's misbehaving lantern did not promise comfort. It promised interruption. Thomas stood with his spade as if it were a staff of office and listened to the hill's new breath. The wind coming off the flats tasted of brine and regret. The fig near the old plots dropped a fruit that split neatly as though cut. A dog barked twice and then tucked its tail, deciding silence was safer than honesty. The noon lantern flickered, and in its weak glow, a locket on the north gate gleamed as if someone had opened and shut it quickly with invisible hands. Thomas closed his eyes and felt the first thread of a path pull at him, a path that would not travel by daylight's mercy, but by markets that open when decent people sleep. A father's grief is a heavy shroud, but for Thomas it had become also a ledger. Every day he wrote his son's name in the margin of tasks done and dues paid, and every night the name erased itself. What really happened to Elias? The town spoke of the river's bad mood, of boys who chased fast money to the coast, of jealous rivals, of careless accidents folded into the hill with a bribed shovel. Thomas had turned each theory in his hands, until its edges dulled and it cut nothing anymore. Yet the noon lantern refused to be sensible. It brightened as a cloud passed and dimmed as clear sky returned, arguing with the sun like a stubborn elder. The chapel's single candle guttered in harmony, though no wind crossed the step. The marble he kept finding on the second stair rolled upward one notch and stopped as if reminded that rules were negotiable. He could not shake the feeling that the lantern was less a sign than a key, and that somewhere nearby a lock waited that was not made of metal. He went to the north gate and found the locket again hooked on the wire. It would not open for him. It would not fall. It simply shone its small, unhelpful shine. What would happen if he followed the lantern at midnight instead of dawn? What would change if he asked the hill to speak in a language his ears did not like? The stakes were not just truth or comfort. They were what the hill would ask in return for an answer, because Stoneview lived on exchanges, and every light on the hill needed fuel from somewhere. When Elias vanished, the ground had been dry and stubborn. The boy left the house with a mango in his pocket and a grin that knew how to perform courage. He cut across the football pitch, lifted a fence slat, and ran toward the ravine where a shortcut lets children feel wise. He did not return. Thomas held 2 rooms on Barron Street, one for sleeping and one he kept assembled as Elias had left it, a boy's room held against time like a breath. The toy truck on the shelf gathered dust in neat layers that remembered wind even when windows stayed shut. A wool cap hung from a nail, brim cracked, sweat dried into a salt map. He had locked the door after 3 years because grief needs borders or it floods. That morning, he touched the key that hung on a faded cord against his chest and felt it warm suddenly as if called. He set a cup of tea on the threshold of the caretaker's hut for whoever wished to enter without being seen and said, quietly, the names of those he had buried that week. The names steadied him. The noon lantern did not. It pulsed in irregular time, and he thought of a heart learning a new rhythm. He considered leaving the hill to the afternoon's heat, but the fig gave a soft creak as if a chair had been moved by a polite ghost. He picked up his spade and walked to the nameless mound near the tree, a swell of ground that had refused every marker he or the elders ever set. The soil here had its own intentions. The lantern's shaky light crawled toward the mound and then drew back like a tongue. He understood that his ordinary patience, the discipline that had kept him from breaking, would not serve him much longer. The hill was about to demand a different shape of courage. Stoneview was not a place unfriendly to wonder. The imam and the priest often blessed the same threshold from different angles. Elders argued about proverbs and concluded that both could be right if rain came on time. Yet even in such a town, the grave lanterns had unsettled the sensible. Some said a river mother sent them. Others swore the hill kept a secret bitterness that required bribes of light to keep it civil. Mothers followed the glow with prayer beads and baskets for leftover mercy. Children were told to keep away because a lantern that bright at midnight can show a child a road he is not ready to walk. Now a lantern had shown itself at noon, and Thomas read it with the skill of a man who had learned to listen to dirt. It pointed toward the old plots, toward the fig, toward the nameless mound, but not merely to a spot on the map. It tugged him toward a threshold between the hill and something else. He remembered a market rumor from years ago, a story told to make apprentices shiver. Each new moon at the far end of Stoneview, beyond the pepper trees and down the chalk path, a night market opened where no daylight stalls ever set up. There, debts could be renegotiated, names could be bought or sold. Shadows could be traded to settle a bill that embarrassed a family in daylight. He had laughed that rumor out of his house with a shake of the head and a push of the door. He did not laugh now. The lantern dimmed, then flared as if agreeing. He felt the key against his chest answer with a faint pulse. The hill had stirred. The market would open soon. At sundown, a hush fell across Stoneview as if the salt flats had leaned their weight against the air. Thomas finished mounding earth over a child's grave and placed Lily without speech. He cleaned his tools slowly, delaying a decision he already knew he had made. The caretaker's path narrowed to a ribbon past the fig, and along that ribbon, a line of dim lights pricked into being, not lanterns, not fireflies, something between. He followed until the fence gave way to a low chalk wall, and beyond that the hill dipped to a field no map bothered to include. Stalls arranged themselves without hands. Mats unfolded in precise squares. A drum thumped once to inform anyone listening that hush had ended. The night market breathed. It smelled of tamarind and old iron and river breath. Faces showed and hid, some concealed by masks carved to resemble creatures who bargain badly in daylight and expertly after dark. A hyena scribe hunched over a low table with a reed pen gripped in his clever hand, ledger open, teeth showing in a grin that understood how debt tastes. Thomas stood at the edge and felt the urge to leave tug against the need to enter. If he stepped forward, the hill would count that step and expect the rest. If he turned back, the lantern at noon would keep misbehaving until it taught him resentment. He put a foot on the market's dust and felt it accept him the way a patient accepts a knife as part of healing. He had brought nothing to sell. He had brought a ribbon cut from his son's cap and the name he had not spoken in public for years. He was ready to learn the price that hid behind answers. Stoneview was less a town than a cluster of obligations gathered around a well. Houses crouched behind thorn fences, doors painted bright to shame the dust. The market square learned a different personality for each day of the week, mild on Mondays, boastful on Fridays, pious on the mornings when drums and bells divided the air into careful halves. From the rim of the cemetery ridge you could see the river's silver shoulder and the salt flats pretending to be lakes. Children ran with kites made of old rice sacks, letting the wind teach them how to hold a string without strangling it. Men repaired nets even when no fish waited. Women beat laundry against stones and sang call and response that kept rhythm. In their arms and politics in their hearts. Between the hill and the town ran a road that livestock learned not to cross alone. The cemetery's iron gate kept its own time, creaking before hands touched it as if preparing to be polite. To live in Stoneview was to live with schedules that bowed to death without becoming helpless. Families saved for weddings and for coffins with equal seriousness. So when grave lanterns began to punctuate the hill's nights, people accepted them as a grace that cost nothing until grace named a price. The day a lantern blinked at noon, stalls in the market trembled as if a drum had struck beneath them. Distant cousins changed travel plans that had never been fixed. The town drew breath and waited for someone to carry a story up or down the hill. Thomas was not a tall man, but he carried space around him the way some men carry wealth. His hands were calloused to a lacquer from spades, ropes, and ledgers. He measured plots with string and kindness, marking the earth with a fairness that outlived quarrels. When families arrived with grief like fire in their bones, he learned to be water. He did not preach, he guided. He placed stools in shade exactly where backs wanted them. He knew where to walk so feet would feel company without needing words. His hut beside the tool shed held 2 cups ready at all times, because loss attracts conversations the way heat attracts flies. On the wall hung a single photograph. In it, Elias displayed a grin that had not yet learned shame. The boy's shoulders angled forward as if pulling time faster. 3 months after the picture, he disappeared. Thomas remained a man whose face taught others to speak softly, yet inside he had become a rope pulled in opposite directions, ritual on one end, a question on the other. He performed his duties with the exactness of someone who fears indulgence. Every evening he walked the perimeter, naming the hill's corners like an inventory. Sometimes he felt the ground reply with a settling he read as agreement. Sometimes it answered with a lift he read as impatience. He wore the key to the upstairs room beneath his shirt and told himself it was a talisman of responsibility, not sorrow's pendant. He lied well enough to work and poorly enough to remain human. Years before the noon lantern, she had appeared at the gate in a shawl the color of cooled ash, collecting stories about family plots no one visited. People called her the Willow Widow because she listened with a downward grace and because a thin green ribbon always figured somewhere in her clothes. She sold no herbs and refused coin, claiming she had already been paid by losses greater than anyone could afford in cash. She never entered the hill without being called, and yet stones seemed to tilt toward her when she stood outside. Thomas had watched her once from the caretaker's path and decided she was a woman. Who knew which names opened doors not made of wood? He avoided her politely. He had built his life upon sensible rituals. He did not wish to convert to someone else's grammar of grief. But the noon lantern shook the hill's rules, and rules are what sensible men live by. When she approached the fig and placed her palm on the nameless mound, sap leaked from the bark with the slow certainty of a confession. She said a thing that did not belong to the hill had been traded to it, and only the night market would return such merchandise. He asked what sort of thing. She said the kind that speaks before bodies do. He knew at once she meant shadow. He wanted to laugh, he did not. Everyone claimed not to believe in the night market, which is how its stalls stayed busy. It opened only when the new moon thinned the sky and the river held its breath, and it sold what day markets cannot safely price. There were vendors who dabbled in lost names, midwives who purchased breathing room for desperate mothers, debtors who swap a year of honest labor for a season of being left alone. and artisans who carve apologies for people who need to offer one without meaning it. And there was the hyena scribe. He kept ledgers written in ink made from soot and river water, bound in goatskin too tough for daylight. People whispered that he could write you out of the story you hated and into one you preferred, for a fee no family admits it paid. He was a myth cemented by specific details, which is the best kind. To reach him, one must walk backward down a chalk path while naming grandparents and great-grandparents, pausing wherever memory buckles. Thomas had mocked that requirement for years as a drunk's dare. Now he found his tongue quietly testing his lineage as he swept the chapel steps. His mouth remembered more than his pride. The noon lantern throbbed faintly when he reached the first ancestor no photograph held. He felt the hill move a degree closer to his shoulder. A father's desire is a simple animal. He wants a place to lay down the missing so that love will stop pacing. Thomas desired an answer more than he feared being laughed at. He desired truth more than he enjoyed the dignity of not knowing. He knew the market would demand something he had relied upon. The willow widow had warned him without yet naming the price, and still he found his feet turning toward dusk with a will of their own. He took from a drawer the ribbon he had cut from Elias's cap and folded it once. He put into his pocket the locket from the gate that refused to open and the marble from the step that refused gravity. These were not charms. They were evidence that the world would cooperate if asked correctly. He poured water into the brass bowl and watched its surface accept a gnat and then refuse dust, the way a conversation accepts one pain and refuses another. He locked the upstairs room and pressed his forehead against the door for a heartbeat. Then he set his spade away and stepped onto the path that leads behind the fig, and down to where the chalk turns to dust and dust turns to a line of stalls that pretend not to exist until you put your foot inside their story. The hill exhaled. The night prepared its ledger. The market opened its first palm. Thomas took his first priceless step toward a bargain he did not yet know how to spell. The night market did not begin so much as reveal itself, the way a river shows its channel when reeds bow aside. Mats unrolled without hands. Clay lamps along the chalk path brightened to a tempered glow that made metal gleam and faces appear, kinder than they were. The first stall sold silence in little gourds, a stopper tied with blue thread. The second offered borrowed courage, measured by mouthfuls from a chipped calabash. Farther on, a bone flute seller tested notes that made stray dogs remember distant owners and sit down. Thomas walked at the market's polite pace, wary of hurrying in a place that prefers patience as currency. He noted a midwife trading 3 lullabies for a sack of grain and a masked scholar renting out apologies written on palm leaves, their ink already fading to keep the borrower safe. Everywhere, shadows moved with their owners but not always in the same direction, as if some had been persuaded to work overtime. He kept his ribbon in his pocket and his son's name behind his teeth. He had expected spectacle and found instead the calm of practiced need. A boy passed with a basket of smoldering herbs, and where the smoke touched Thomas's coat, it carried a scent like rain at a grave. He felt the hill beneath the market as a sleeper shifts beneath a thin blanket. All the rumors were wrong in the way rumors must be to survive. This was not a carnival of wickedness. It was a court for debts daylight cannot safely count. Somewhere nearby a laugh cut short and turned into bargaining. Somewhere a bell rang once to remind traders the moon would not hold still. Thomas breathed and kept his hands visible. He was here to buy only one thing, and the market would decide what that required in return. Near a cluster of stalls draped with indigo, a mask maker worked with tools that gleamed like the answers people hope for. Wooden faces stared up from this cloth, some gentle, some sly, some with mouths too wide for comfort. He greeted Thomas with the courtesy reserved for men who do not know if they are buyers or offerings. He asked whether Thomas had come to trade a name for peace or a shadow for time. Thomas said he had come to find where a boy's shadow ran when the body stopped. And the mask maker's hands paused with a sympathy that did not spill into pity. He explained that shadows can be light-fingered, eager to barter themselves to pay a debt the living should have paid in words. If a boy laughed at the wrong hour near the wrong wall, a shadow monger could catch that laugh and stamp it into a mask, selling the echo to a patron who wanted youth's brightness without the bother of raising a child. Thomas felt the ribbon grow hot in his pocket, the fabric remembering a scalp and sweat. The mask maker lifted a half-carved hyena face and tapped its teeth. "Beware the scribe," he said softly, "for he writes what the market will honor and what the hill will obey. His ledgers do not erase. He does fair business by unfair measures. If you ask him for the last words your son heard, he will ask for breath you were saving for another day." Thomas asked where to find this hyena scribe who sorted truth into lines so even a grave could read them. The mask maker tilted his chin toward a stall near the market's coldest shadow, where a figure hunched, writing as if the world would end if he looked up. He told Thomas to approach with his own ancestors on his tongue and his pride folded small. He told him to speak only bargains he could endure hearing repeated at his funeral. He returned to carving, and the hyena face on his mat seemed to smile in advance of someone else's mistake. The hyena scribe sat behind a low table layered with goat parchment so thin the lamp's light came through it, making the ink look like a map of rivers inside skin. His coat carried the dust of roads traveled by men who speak in promises and collect in cash. His teeth showed because hyenas are built to grin even when solemn. And solemn he was, eyes amber, claws of his right hand stained with soot and something that smelled faintly of iron. Thomas greeted him and offered the ribbon and the locket and the marble as proof that the hill wished to negotiate. The scribe did not touch them. He asked Thomas to name his father's father, and the one before. And Thomas did, halting only once, and the scribe's pen scratched an extra curl that forgave the stutter without forgetting it. He asked what Thomas wanted, not a rumor, not a dream, not an image in water, but a precise item to be invoiced, the boy's last words and the name of the last man who spoke to him as companion rather than witness. The scribe nodded as if checking a box only he could see. He explained the rate. A voice costs breath, and borrowed breath demands a return with interest paid in habit. Thomas would surrender the patience that had kept him until now. He would not receive it back, and when slow waiting came to him by reflex, it would slide off like oil and leave him raw. In return, the market would fetch the echo sealed at the fence line and deliver it in wind. Thomas asked for guarantees. The scribe opened another ledger bound with a strip of hyena hide and showed him entries that read like court judgments, names scored, debts marked, settled with a slash shaped like a crescent moon. No one argued with that ledger. Thomas's hand trembled once and then steadied. He said yes. The scribe dipped his pen and wrote the bargain into the book with a flourish that felt like a tooth marking bone. The lamp hissed. The market paused around them as if the moon had cocked its ear. Deals at the night market do not hurt immediately. They begin as a damp sleeve, a shoe with a hidden stone, a song you cannot sing at the note that used to be easy. Thomas felt it as a restless itch under the ribs where waiting had nested like a tame bird. The scribe blew on the ink and sprinkled ash that fixed the words against erasure. He spoke a phrase in a language the hill remembers from when it was still learning to be ground. The lamps dimmed and returned. Across the market, a woman wept once with relief, and a man slapped a counter with the despair of discovering the exact change he must pay. The scribe finally touched Thomas's offerings. He lifted the ribbon and held it to his nose, a gesture half animal, half priest, then set it on the ledger. The locket opened under his claw as easily as an apology practiced. Too late. Inside lay a strand of hair caught on a pinch of salt. He sniffed the marble and rolled it under his palm to feel stories flattened by weight. He returned them with a courtesy that stung because it made this feel like ordinary trade. Thomas asked when the voice would come. The scribe nodded toward the hill. At the hour when goats forget to bleat and even rumors rest, the wind would bring the words. Thomas would hear the whistle that taught boys when to jump and when to duck. He would hear the last joke spoken in bravado and the last instruction spoken in fear. The scribe warned him to stand beside witnesses when wind arrived, because truth likes company when it announces itself. He also warned that once a father knows, he begins to bleed a different color, and the town changes its distance accordingly. Thomas swallowed the metallic taste of future loneliness, and bowed his thanks he did not feel. The market resumed its hum as if a liver had been sliced cleanly and tucked back. When Thomas stepped back from the ledger, the ground seemed to regain. An inch it had ceded while the bargain was written. He did not trust himself to linger near stalls that sold rest to men who had just bought trouble. He passed the mask maker who didn't look up, and a weaver who tied knots so tight they made promises true by force. At the market's edge the willow widow waited, shawl holding a temperature that never belonged to the hour. She asked whether he had traded what could be spared and kept what could not. He told her the price, and she did not soften it with any sweet. She said the hill would now hold him to his end of the work, which is what the hill had wanted all along. A father willing to stand between silence and a name without rehearsing how to look noble doing it. She told him to prepare a bowl of water at the chapel and to ask the imam and the priest to arrive before dawn, because wind that carries voices respects doors opened by both prayers. She advised him to fast from speech until the hour, so that his mouth would not spend courage on small uses. He nodded and kept his silence. As he climbed the path, the market thinned behind him like steam, leaving a black pot. At the chalk wall, he turned once and saw the hyena scribe glance up finally, eyes catching lamplight like coins. The scribe lifted his pen in a small salute that was also a threat. By the time Thomas reached the fig, the noon lantern was dark and the hill's lamps had learned to behave again. The key at his chest had cooled to the temperature of bone. He stepped onto the caretaker's path and felt a draft run along his ankles, the first messenger. He tightened his jaw against the urge to hurry. Night pressed its ear to the chapel to listen for the hour when the wind would decide to tell him exactly what he had paid to hear. Thomas left the market with his tongue quiet, as the widow advised, and set the chapel in order with hands that would not keep still. He washed the brass bowl until it showed sky instead of his face, and carried water from the ravine in one pour, careful to disturb neither surface nor shoulder. He sent word to the imam and to Father Daniel, asking them to arrive without ceremony and to stand on the threshold together. He lit the candle and watched the flame lean, then steady, then lean again, as if rehearsing how it would greet what was coming. The hill moved underfoot in the way ground rearranges itself before rain. He placed the ribbon from Elias's cap on the pew where the boy had once slept through a service with a defiance that passed for innocence. He set the locket and the marble on the step, small offerings to a truth he hoped would prefer gentleness to spectacle. When the imam came, he brought a verse about doors that open to those who knock sincerely. When the priest came, he brought a psalm that speaks of shadows learning to walk toward light. They nodded to each other the way men do when grief forces them to be brothers. The widow took no place of honor. She stood near the fig outside, palm flat on bark as if monitoring a pulse. The hour thinned, crickets stuttered and fell silent. Goats forgot to bleat, and then remembered, embarrassed. Thomas stood between the threshold and the bowl and felt the last of his old patience slide from his ribs like a coat shrugged off in heat. He let it go. He did not know what would take its place, only that a man can learn to carry new weight if he agrees to stop arguing with the load. It began as a draft at the ankles. The mischievous child Thomas had felt on nights he could not sit still. The candle twitched in salute and then held. The water shivered once and cleared its throat. Then the wind rose to speaking height and shaped Thomas's name, testing whether his attention was whole. He answered with his mouth shut, a habit learned from burying secrets for a living. The wind said Elias as a father says it when calling a boy home for supper, and then it gave way to the voices he had bought at the market. First his son, bright and impatient, counting steps to the fence, teasing about a mask seller at the river who claimed to carve shadows into smiles. Then the second voice, older, practiced, walking with the slow authority of a man who has keys to places boys want to see. Mosi Daka, the former assistant gravedigger who left the hill after a scandal about missing tools and a ledger that refused to balance. He spoke in the tone of the uncle who teaches mischief the town forgives. He showed the boys how to lift the board behind the school and bragged about the night market where a shadow can be rented to pay a debt until harvest. Elias laughed the laugh that offends rules, and the wind carried it to Thomas so clean it felt cut from bone. A whistle sounded, short and practiced, followed by the thud of a misjudged jump and the swear of a man who fears witnesses. The drag came next, a new rhythm, the sound of feet deciding on concealment rather than confession. The imam lifted his verse in a whisper. The priest pressed the sign of his faith into the air as if sealing a document. Thomas saw nothing, but hearing was enough. The names had found their way to his ears without asking permission to soften. He gripped the pew with both hands and let the voices finish without begging them to be kinder. The wind closed with the sound of a mask snapped shut and a ledger page turned by a claw. Silence settled with weight. The bowl stopped quivering. The candle did not gutter. The hill had fulfilled its part of the bargain without apology. Relief arrived too quickly and carried poison behind it. Thomas wanted to run from the chapel and knock on Mosi Daka's door with both fists and the voices still warm on his breath. Instead he felt the new emptiness assert itself where patience used to live. His feet would not wait while his head arranged a plan. He thanked the imam and the priest, who both looked at him with the knowledge that helping a man cross a river does not teach him how to rest on the other bank. The widow met him under the fig and studied his shoulders. She said he should bring witnesses before his mouth became a weapon he could not aim. He nodded, already walking. The noon lantern glowed although noon was far away, a small rebellion. He took as encouragement. At the gate, the locket lifted and fell as if a neck had passed through it. In the market, stalls watched him rather than the other way around. Women drew children a step closer, not from fear of him, but from fear of what truth does when fresh. He reached the lane where Mosi rented a back room behind a tinsmith's shop and felt the ground shorten the distance, as if the hill had moved its boundary to put the two men within reach of each other. The breath that used to make waiting possible had already been spent on the wind's voice. In its absence stood a new air that quickened his limbs and made the world tilt slightly toward confrontation. He reminded himself to walk like a man, ready to listen and not like a storm masquerading as justice. He failed by half. The door to Mosi's room was open. Inside, a mask hung on a nail, hyena-faced and smirking. Thomas stepped onto the threshold that divides accusation from inquiry and tried to choose a word that would hold both. Mosi Daka had the careful neatness of a man rebuilding his reputation one chore at a time. His room smelled of oil, clay dust, and a sweeter note Thomas could not name until he saw the bowl of tamarind on the table. Mosi looked up with the smile he kept for parish committees and widows who paid late. Thomas spoke his name and did not add courtesy. He said he knew about the fence board, the whistle, the drag, and the mask snapped shut as if sealing a debt. He did not say the word shadow because daylight breaks it if you handle it clumsily. Mosi's smile lost one tooth of brightness and then regained it by force. He spoke of boys who run ahead of their father's caution, of games that go wrong, of how grief teaches men to hear ghosts making accusations that the living cannot answer. Thomas told him about the night market ledger, the hyena scribe's ink, the bargain that stole his patience to buy the voice that named Mosi as the last companion and the first coward. Mosi spread his hands, palms up, the gesture of innocence. Taught to men who can afford lessons. He said he left the hill to stop talk of missing spades and loose nails, and that he had not whistled in years because whistles make people think of dogs. Thomas took a step inward and felt his shadow lag and then snapped to heel. The tinsmith in the next room chose that moment to hammer softly, the way neighbors do when they can smell trouble and wish to pretend they cannot. The widow appeared in the doorway behind Thomas as if dusk had sent her in advance. She did not look at Mosi. She told Thomas to bring him to the fig, where words would have to choose whether to harden into truth. Mosi hesitated the precise length a liar does when calculating who else will be present. Then he reached for his hat. His eyes slid to the hyena mask on the nail and away, too quickly, as if the wood had whispered a price he had not finished paying. They climbed toward Stoneview in a procession that made neighbors pretend to sweep. The imam and the priest waited under the fig, and two elders had joined them with faces arranged into the mask the community wears when it intends to be fair. The locket on the gate watched like a dull eye. Thomas placed the ribbon on the mound and asked Mosi to speak the boy's name first, then his own, then the story that binds the two. Mosi spoke Elias softly and himself more loudly, like a man entering a registry, and he began to describe a foolish afternoon in terms that made boys everywhere sound the same. The widow interrupted in a whisper and asked him to include the part where a man in debt sells time he cannot afford to repay. Mosi flinched, then found a smile, then let it go. He said he had taken Elias to the fence because the boy spoke of the night market as a joke that needed a punchline. He had whistled, without thinking, the way a man does who misses being asked for instructions. He had watched the boy jump, watched the branch bend and the ground fail to behave like a cushion, and he had dragged him to the ravine because he thought hiding the boy would protect the men who hire boys. He spoke quickly now, like a thief, returning coins while counting any he thinks he can still keep. He denied the mask and the shadow. The wind rose against his denial and brought the sound of a ledger page turning. The elders looked at one another with the expression of men who have found truth not heroic, only ordinary and unforgivable. Thomas felt no triumph and less peace. The hill accepted Mosi's words and took its first measure from Thomas in return. A coolness ran along his forearms and settled in his wrists, the precise place where a gravedigger's patience lives when he is waiting by a hole. That coolness did not return. He would never again be able to wait the way he had. It was the bargain's immediate gift and punishment both. The lantern near the fig glowed weakly, then steadied as if committing itself to a path that would no longer tolerate detours. He stood under its small steadiness and understood that knowledge does not conclude a story. It begins the part where a man must walk without the habit that once saved him. For 1 hour after Mosi's half-confession, Thomas felt a lightness so new it made his steps careless. He cleaned the chapel with vigor and repaired a hinge that had squealed for months without complaint from anyone but him. He brewed tea and filled 2 cups as if a guest might arrive honest enough to deserve the second. He walked to Barron Street with the idea of unlocking the upstairs room and letting air fold itself into corners that had memorized dust. Yet when he reached the door and turned the key, his hand shook not with sorrow, but with a restless energy that would not be directed into ritual. Waiting had been taken from him, and its place, urgency pounded like a child wanting to be seen. The room smelled exactly as it had, eucalyptus and old wool and a trace of soap, but the scent no longer comforted. The toy truck on the shelf seemed smaller, a prop from a play he could no longer pretend would return to performance. He set the truck on the table, and it slid an inch toward the window, the way wood behaves on a surface it does not trust. He told himself the table was not level. He told himself floors shift as buildings age. He stepped to the window to test the frame and caught his reflection with a second shape lagging behind him. Not a person, not a piece of furniture, a hesitation where a shadow should glue itself. He reached to touch the glass and found it cool in the center and warm at the edges as if the house were deciding whether to welcome him back. Relief had entered the room and pulled the chairs out. Then unease sat down without asking permission. When good news arrives wearing work boots, what do you do when it tracks mud across your last safe floor? At Stoneview, the sun went about its work and gave Thomas a long, clear shadow as he crossed the caretaker's path. At the Fig, the shadow shortened as it should, but near the nameless mound it thinned until a child could have cut it with a twig. He stepped sideways and watched it lag by a breath, not enough to frighten a crowd, enough to tell a man who monitors the honesty of light. His coat sleeve raised a fraction without wind. The locket on the gate clicked with no hand to close it. Dogs looked toward him and then chose to look past, tails making the compromise wag that says a creature will be polite and nothing more. He lifted his spade and felt its weight shift toward the blade as if it preferred digging to carrying. The hill had given him voice and taken the cushion that made days tolerable. It now began to adjust his perimeter of comfort, pulling him a half-step closer to edges he once managed by patience alone. He walked to the ravine and looked down, expecting the familiar hush. Instead, he felt a small draft climb to his knees like a child trying to be counted. He whispered Elias's childhood name once, and the ravine answered with a string of goat bleats that did not belong to goats. He closed his eyes and named 2 ancestors to steady himself. The names held, his shadow settled by a thumb's width, as if embarrassed to have been seen misbehaving. The willow widow watched him from the path and lifted a palm in greeting without moving closer. She understood that a man adjusting to a new gravity stumbles better without an audience. How do you practice standing when the ground insists on a small dance? By midweek, the market behaved as if a thin glass had been placed between Thomas and transactions. The butcher wiped his knife and let another customer step forward without calling Thomas by name. The salt seller pretended to count and counted longer than salt requires. Children who once asked him to kick a ball now studied the sky with sudden interest. He did not blame them. Truth makes good people prefer the safety of polite distance. Caleb Nelavu had disappeared into legal consultations that made noise but not progress. Mosi avoided the square entirely and sent a boy to buy tamarind with a note folded too neatly. The imam nodded with a kindness that behaved like a bandage. Father Daniel offered prayer like a tool he could lend rather than a declaration. The Feidu widow's shawl turned the same gray as the cloud that hovered over the flats, a portable dusk. She told Thomas to expect the hill to ask for one more deed before it settled into being grateful. He asked whether this would cost breath, money, or reputation. She said reputation bends to wind and money grows back for men who keep moving, but breath must be rationed like water until the river returns. He felt the truth of that rationing every time he tried to sit in the shade. His legs leaned up and his heart leaned forward. When the living step back and the dead lean in, where does a man place his chair? Night sleep arrived in fragments cut by sharp transitions. Thomas would doze in the caretaker's chair and wake hearing a whistle at the wrong pitch. He would nod again and see the north fence firm in a memory that had been corrected by repair, only to watch one board lift at the corner as neatly as a tongue lifting a name. He woke with his palms pressed to the table, fingers splayed as if he were holding paper in a wind, and found the ledger open to a page bearing his own handwriting in a line he had never written. Bring him home properly. He tested the ink and found it dry. He wanted to suspect a prank and could not afford the luxury of pretending. He locked the ledger and hid the key in the box where he kept the locket on nights he did not trust his own gentleness. The candle burned straight, a good sign, and then sputtered twice at nothing, a sentiment without reason. In the upstairs room he stood in the doorway and spoke aloud to the chair again, telling it that furniture must not be asked to work beyond its station. He smiled at himself, and the smile did not fill with warmth. He closed the door and felt the absence of waiting more sharply than the ache of grief. Without that habit, he was a man pushed toward a cliff and asked to learn flight in the step before air. What do you hold on to when your best rope has been cut by your own hand? When witness is thin, a man must choose between becoming a spectacle or a worker of small consistencies, Thomas chose work. He repaired a row of subsiding stones where families had stopped visiting. He swept the chapel steps until the brass bowl shone without reflecting a face. He carried water to the fig and poured a ring that kept roots guessing. He taught a new boy the string method for measuring graves so arguments end before heat gathers. He visited Luma's aunt with a sack of rice and an apology that did not demand reciprocation. Each task anchored him while the hill rearranged his comforts. Yet even in work, isolation shadowed him. At the mosque courtyard, men spaced themselves as if an extra prayer mat had been placed between each body and his. At the church stoop, a mother who used to let her toddler play with his cap's tassel chose a different route. The only creature that came close without calculation was a stray cat that curled against his boot and slept as if the world had finally made a pocket for one small piece. He stroked its back once and felt his breath settle into a thinner but steadier rhythm. He found a prayer that fit this new lung. Let the work be right. Let the truth keep walking, even if I cannot sit. Let what the hill asks be the last cut before the stitching begins. He stood and knew the next cut would soon announce itself. When healing demands another incision, can gratitude hold still? The officer returned with a warrant and 2 elders, carrying the authority that weighs less on paper than in eyes. They opened the square Thomas had cut beside the nameless mound, not the center, and the soil yielded objects that behaved like punctuation in a sentence no one had wanted to finish. The twin of the brass anchor button surfaced first, a sailor's token in landlocked ground. Then a knuckle bone small enough to hide in a story, but too particular to confuse with animal. Silence fell the way it does when a community realizes its denial has been overheard by the ground. The elders did not speak in proverbs. The officer did not say unfortunate. He labeled and logged. He sent for a box whose interior had learned how to hold what cannot bear air for long. Thomas stood very straight, not to be brave, but to avoid, bending toward the hole with a hunger that would have shamed him. The widow spoke the words that returned things to their proper owners and added a line that made the figs quiet. She said the piece had been moved twice, once by a storm and once by a good man digging to save another family's name from flood. Thomas closed his eyes and saw himself as part of the hiding, a companion in the erasure he had sworn to end. The horror wore no crimson cloak. It stood in clay the color of duty and asked him to hold both roles without pretending one cancels the other. When knowledge reveals you as both victim and unknowing instrument, does your spine bow or straighten? He felt it straighten, not with pride, but with the practicality required to carry a double load. Work remained. He would do it. Public heat flared and cooled in the way towns must do to go on living. Gossip worked its route, and then stumbled on facts sturdy enough to slow it. Thomas did not feed the fire with speeches. He went to the council and asked for funds to reroute stormwater, so the ravine stopped inviting secrets to travel. He volunteered to teach 3 lads how to shore up the north fence without cutting corners that look neat and fail under weight. He visited the courthouse to sit through proceedings against Mosi, even when the testimony made his throat grit. He answered no questions outside the witness stand. He spoke the truth in sentences that a tired clerk could write without breaking the nib. He walked home by streets that now gave him space without malice. At the night market's next opening, he returned not as a buyer but as a man with a complaint. He laid the hyena scribe's ledger number before him and asked that the debt be recorded publicly, not merely paid. He requested an entry that said, in daylight words, that trading in shadows to settle coin earns curses that spread like weeds. The scribe grinned, because hyenas are built that way, but his pen scratched and the ink settled. A drum at the market's edge spoke once, the sound justice makes when it pretends not to enjoy its own music. Does restitution require ceremony, or does ceremony protect restitution from rust? He chose ceremony when it nudges men into remembering. Stoneview gathered under the pepper trees to hear the verdict on Mosidaka. The court language tasted of sawdust, but the meaning landed with clean edges. Negligence named, concealment named. Cooperation with repair spared him a longer darkness. Some wept because the story had not grown bigger than human failure. Some because it had. Afterward, Caleb Ndlovu arrived late with a folder of paper designed to make noise and found no audience for his clatter. The imam and the priest stood together and declared a day for labor rather than a day for shame. Thomas led crews to lay new trenches and made sure the first spade belonged to a boy who had once bragged about jumping fences. The boy set the blade, leaned with both hands, and smiled when the cut line held true. The widow placed her palm on the fig and told Thomas the hill wished for one more proper act. Bring home what can be carried and name what cannot. He understood. He asked the officer for the small bone when its work in court had ended, not to keep as a morbid relic, but to return to ground with the right prayers and the right witnesses. He invited Luna's aunt and the mask maker, the imam and the priest, 2 elders and the boy who had cut the trench line, because communities must carry weight with more than shoulders. If a last test simply asks whether you will do the right thing in front of others, what answer do your hands give before your mouth? At dusk they gathered by the fig, and Thomas opened the little box the officer gave him, hands steady, breath shallow with respect. He cradled the bone as if it were a seed requiring warmth and names. The imam spoke the lineage that does not fit. On paper, the priest spoke a psalm that knows how to hold water without spilling. The mask maker set the hyena face on the ground, mouth downward, to show crafts can be taught to listen. The widow directed the small work with the certainty of someone who has already paid every price a market can invent. Thomas placed the bone into the earth beside the mound where storm and ignorance had mixed their intentions, then pressed soil over it with his palms, fingerprints making a pattern that rain would understand. He untied the ribbon from his neck and tied it to a low branch for wind to manage, accepting that not all ties must be worn to be honored. He spoke Elias's name not to summon a ghost, but to acknowledge a life that moved many lives and then stopped. The hill accepted the return with a sigh you could feel in your ankles. The lanterns brightened in honest sequence as evening properly arrived. The price of redemption stood in the shape Thomas had become, a man without the old patience, but with a new readiness to work in daylight what he once managed in the hush. Redemption did not give back what he had traded. It gave him tasks that felt like breath. Is peace the return of what was lost, or the skill to live with what remains? He chose the second and found it enough. Weeks later, a new marker appeared near the fig bearing 2 words chosen by a committee that surprised itself with wisdom. Brought home. Beneath it, Thomas added a line with his neat worker's hand. The ground keeps what we give it and returns what we confess. Stoneview learned to visit the hill without hurrying. Children were taught to respect fence lines, not because boards break, but because secrets do not like being asked to carry weight twice. The night market continued its business, but a posted entry in the hyena scribe's ledger made traders think before buying charm with borrowed shadows. Thomas kept the upstairs room open during daylight, and on some afternoons the toy truck sat on the windowsill and looked perfectly ordinary because it was. He never regained the old habit of waiting. He gained instead a walk that covered more ground with fewer words. When families came to bury their dead, he showed them how to say what must be said to keep hills from swallowing more than they should. He did not sell hope. He offered craft. He did not dramatize curses. He taught the grammar that keeps them from forming. As the sun lowered, he stood by the gate where the locket had finally fallen open and found inside a grain of salt that refused to dissolve, a reminder that some tears finish their work and some remain to season memory. If you were here, standing where the hill breathes and the town listens, what would you do with a secret that asks to be turned into a story that helps others walk straighter? Tell me in the comments what you would have traded for the truth. And subscribe for more journeys where land, memory, and courage decide together how a story should end. Thanks for watching till the end. If this story gave you goosebumps, give it a like and make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment below and let me know what city or country you're tuning in from. I read everyone. Till then, take care, folks.